In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is episode 141 coming to you week after week. Last week, if you hadn't had the chance, we brought in two fellows from the Heartland Institute as we discussed the Green New Deal, and there was a lot of great feedback and actually a lot of views on that one, which was great. A lot of folks are interested in politics, I guess. And so that's something that while we're not partisan here at Veracity Hill, we do like to look at political issues because the Christian worldview is all-encompassing. There's not an inch in this world that doesn't belong to God, and that includes the political realm and ideas about that. So hopefully folks weren't too put off by our discussion last week, but I'd love to get your feedback nevertheless. On this week's episode, we're talking about cultural apologetics. But before we get to that, I have one brief announcement here regarding our upcoming event in Dyer, Indiana, Discovering Truth. On May 3 and 4, we've got keynote speakers Mike Lacona, Cisco Cotto, and Ted Wright. And it's going to be a great opportunity for folks to come and hear a number of different apologetic topics. If you want to grow in your faith, and if you perhaps want to invite a friend, a seeker who wants to hear Christian intellectual responses to maybe objections or questions, concerns that they might have to our faith, it's a good opportunity to come. And I do believe we will be recording all the sessions, so if you can't join us, I understand. But if you want to learn more, you can go to thedefendersconference.com/Dyer, and you can see more about the schedule, other speakers, and register for the event as well. And we're grateful for partnering with the Village Church of Dyer and even the Village Church of Oak Park to make this event happen. So, and also let me say, this isn't to be confused with the annual Defenders Conference, but just one of our smaller events that we do. So the annual conference is coming up later in October on Gospel Differences, which that'll be an exciting time. More on that forthcoming. All right, well, in today's episode, we're talking about cultural apologetics, and joining us is Dr. Paul Gould. He's the founder of the Two Tasks Institute and the author of his recent book, now published, I think, just last week or something like that, Cultural Apologetics, Renewing the Christian Voice, Conscience, and Imagination in a Disenchanted World. So here it is, put out by Zondervan, available now. And also, I want to make sure I don't forget this really great 15-lesson, 2-disc set on DVD. Great opportunity for you if you want to lead a small group through it. You can see there's some nice photos of the video work there by Zondervan. Paul, thank you so much for joining us on our program today.
You bet, Kurt. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes. And so you are a philosopher, someone who thinks deeply about the way that the world is. And just looking through your CV, you have, some high-level, philosophy of religion articles and publications. But this book here is something a little different. I mean, certainly there is philosophy to it, and it's mixed in, but it's not philosophy proper. I mean, in a sense, we're talking about way to engage with the culture, but in a sense, you're doing something not just high level for the ivory tower. You're trying to reach people, aren't you?
Yeah. It's interesting. Although I teach philosophy, I'm a philosopher. I also have been a campus minister for over 16 years with a crew, and so I have a real big heart for this question. It's actually been a question I've been wrestling with for probably almost 2.5, 3 decades. How does the gospel get a fair hearing in our culture today? And so it's kind of this weird blend of this history of trying to share the gospel in a place that sometimes is not open or hostile or misunderstands the gospel, and then wanting to think clearly about the topic too. So it's a nice little blend, I'd say, of philosophy and just practical. How do we get the gospel out so that people actually see it for what it is? Things like that.
Yeah, it's odd because you're still, you're not doing, but in the practical, there still is the dealing with the ideas and how that should be dealt. So, of course, in one sense, it is philosophical. You're presenting arguments, you're presenting a case here, but it's a case for how we should engage with people. It's not, say, a case for making a case.
That's right.
And in fact, as I was looking through the book, came across a fine passage where you were sitting down at dinner with a fellow, and you had gone forth and just spewed out a 20-minute case for Christianity, and you realized it wasn't working. Nothing that you had said really connected with him, and a switch flipped in you, and you're like, tell me about your objections against the Christian belief or against God. And then you write here that he went to pour out his heart about his life circumstances. And so for many people, they think apologetics is just about the arguments. It's about debating. I had coffee with a fellow just a couple weeks ago, and before he met me, that's kind of what he thought. He's like, "Oh, I'm not into apologetics," But then I explained it. Apologetics isn't just about the arguments, but it's about winsome persuasion. It's about leading people to Christ. And so what you're arguing here with cultural apologetics is that we need to lead people to Christ, and we need to do so in more ways than just, here's the Kalam cosmological argument, here's Pascal's wager, here's the argument for the resurrection. And so you look at presenting this winsome persuasion as it not just flows from our character, but goes out into society, into the things we do, the things we create, bringing people interested, making them re-enchanted with the world. And so before I continue on, hopefully I'm not spoiling anything. First, why don't we get sort of your take. What is, in your view, what is cultural apologetics?
Yeah, okay. Well, how about if I back up and let's talk a little bit about the problem I'm trying to address.
Sure.
And that will actually give us a segue into, what do I mean by cultural apologetics? But the way that I've been thinking about this is, there's this interesting thing. About 50 years ago, sociologists were predicting that by the time the 21st century rolled around, that religion would be gone, that we would be a secular society, and things like that. What's interesting, we find ourselves now in the 21st century, but some of those same sociologists, Peter Berger being one of them, has basically said we are totally wrong. Religion did not go away. In fact, they say we live in now what's called a post-secular world. And religion is really poised to play this dominant role in the next century. And of course, we see this every day on our news feeds as well. But what's interesting about that, you might think, okay, this is good news for Christianity, and it is good news. And of course, when we put our theology caps on, we know that you can't sort of wipe out spirituality like you can wipe out grease in a pan. I mean, this is just how we're created. But at the same time, even with this renewed interest in religion and spirituality, much of the West, at least, of which many of us find ourselves in, we live in what's called maybe a post-Christian or a sub-Christian or an anti-Christian, depending on the pockets we find ourselves in, kind of culture. And so as a result, though, what I'm finding is that three worries. Number one, the church largely we no longer see Jesus as relevant to all aspects of life. And there's this rampant sort of anti-intellectualism. It's in the culture and it's in the church. But one of the key results of that is that the gospel doesn't get a fair hearing because many people don't think we have anything to say when it comes to truth. Add to that, though, the reality that as Christians, many of us are as fragmented as our non-believing neighbors. And, weekly we read of Christian leaders that disqualify themselves from ministry for moral failures or things like that. And so as a result, the church is no longer able to really exercise her prophetic voice into culture, which is historically one of the roles that we're called to play in our culture, to be salt and light. So the Christian conscience has become muted in our culture today, and it's just not viable. It's not desirable. And then you add to that, not just the Christian voice and the Christian conscience, but many of us as Christians, we view the world in basically the same categories as everybody else. And so we'll use language like this to describe the world we live in. We'll say the world is ordinary, or the world is mundane, or the world is everyday. But in reality, that's not the way the world is, right? The world is it's beautiful and it's majestic, and it's, to use the proper word, it's sacred, it's gift, it's enchanted. And so as a result, though, the collective mood of both people largely within the church, but really our culture at large, is what I would call disenchanted. And so we've lost the Christian imagination. And so the question then is, for those in culture today, in the 21st century, for many, Christianity is viewed as either implausible or undesirable or both. And so that was the problem. That's the issue that I want to address, is how can we work to reestablish that Christian voice and the Christian conscience and that Christian imagination so that the gospel will actually be seen as true to the way the world is and also true to the way the world ought to be. So, and so cultural apologetics is basically this idea that we value all parts of what it means to be human. The rational parts, of course, we still need and we must give arguments because we're rational animals who seek truth. But we're not merely rational animals, right? We long for goodness, right? We have a conscience. And so we have to help show how Jesus and the gospel connects to these longings for wholeness, our longing for justice, our longing to live a significant life. Those are all part of what I believe, what I would call this longing for goodness that the conscience is guiding us toward. But then we're also imaginative creatures. We long for beauty. And of course, Christ is the source of goodness, truth, and beauty. And so he's given us reason, the imagination, and the conscience. And so basically I'm taking all of that and thinking about, what does it mean to be human, humans that live in culture and make culture and then are shaped by culture, and how can the gospel be viewed as plausible and desirable within that context? So that's a little bit about what the project is and what cultural apologetics is.
Nice. Okay, before continuing on with material from the book, I want to ask you here, because I think this is a great opportunity for you to talk about the Two Tasks Institute and the work that you're doing there. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so let's see, years ago, so I'm kind of a visionary guy. I've learned that I'm not super creative, but I kind of have lots of ideas and vision. And probably 20 years ago, I was at seminary in Talbot studying philosophy, and I was reading, I was reading J.P. Moreland's book, Love the Lord Your God with All Your Mind, and there's one sentence somewhere, and I need to go find it, but it basically said, where are all the evangelical foundations that are funding future scholars? And that put a seed in my mind because, as a campus minister who knows there's money out there and knows how to raise it, I'm like, where is all the foundations that have this sort of long-term vision? And so that 20 years ago idea of shaping and investing in future professors who are key culture shapers for one area of culture, that is the university, which is concerned with truth, that's kind of grown over the years to consider not just how we can engage the key culture shaping institutions with respect to truth, which is the university, but also with respect to beauty, which is the art, and goodness, which would be the city and business and maybe government too. And so the Two Tasks Institute, which was the idea was birthed over 20 years ago, was launched recently to basically address those two questions. How can we show Christianity reasonable? That's one task. And how can we show it desirable? That's the other task. And so I gathered a group of friends, and we're we have our own podcast called the Udo Podcast, which you can check out. We're creating lots of videos and content and study guides and basically resources to help re-enchant the world, and we'll talk about that, so that the gospel will actually be plausible. So we're just praying that God will raise up a movement of people that want to join to help, on this long-term project of sowing the soil so that the seed of the gospel would take root and bear fruit.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so you sort of provide a foundation here for what you see as the problem and hence the need for cultural apologetics. And some of this has come because people have become disenchanted with the way the world is. You say, some people say it's just mundane, it's ordinary, it bugs me so much. Even Christians think this is the case. There's the hymn, I'm just passing through. I forget the exact lyrics of that song, that hymn, but basically it's about Christians just saying, I'm just living here, just abiding my time until the better days, and it's like, no, God has created this beautiful world, and there's so much kingdom work to do. People, so many, especially in America, where people watch so much TV, they just entertain themselves. There are folks that are just on their iPhones all the time watching videos. Right. Especially younger folks, they're on YouTube all the time. It's like, whoa, get out of that world. There's a world right in front of you, and let's talk about it, and let's make it beautiful again. And so that's geared towards the Christians, of course, but cultural apologetics is also about reaching the non-Christian who thinks the world is this way. If you're an atheist and you think all we are is space dust, just somehow organized space dust, well, there is nothing beautiful about this world. It just is. Right. And so you've talked about the different forms of disenchantment. So I'll let you go ahead and speak more to that.
Yeah, so this word disenchantment, that's the word I use in the book. And so I mean something very specific by that. And it answers the question, what is the dominant way of perceiving in our world today? And so the answer is disenchantment. And what that means is what I said earlier, that we no longer have eyes to see the world in its proper light. And if we don't see it in its proper light, we don't appreciate it as gift, we don't enjoy it in creaturely response and things like that. But the interesting thing is, so we live in a disenchanted world, and Charles Taylor, who's a Catholic philosopher, has done a ton to bring this kind of language into prominence with his sort of mammoth work. It's a 900-page book called The Secular Age, but the term actually came from Max Weber earlier in the 20th century, and what was interesting, though, what unlocked it for me, and the idea was actually reading C.S. Lewis, who's one of my favorite sort of people to read, and I came across this essay that's not well known by Lewis. It's called Talking About Bicycles. And in there, he writes this essay about a bicycle, and he uses that as an example for these 4 stages that we go through with pretty much respect to everything. And so let me just tell you the 4 stages, because it kind of pulled some things together in Lewis, and actually I see it in Tolkien, and I see it in all the ancient writers as well. But for the bike, Lewis says, you come into the world as an infant, and the bike and everything else in the adult world means nothing to us. So we're unenchanted. That would be the first stage. And then he says, as a child, kind of imagine that moment, for those of you listening here, the moment when the training wheels came off your bike, or if you have children, that moment when that happens and the child rides that bike for the first time on his own. And this, you enter into what Lewis would call the second stage, which is the enchanted stage. And the idea there is that everything as it should be. And riding that bike brings joy and delight and things like that. But then he says, pretty quickly we enter into that third stage with respect to that bike. And, as a guy that grew up riding everywhere on his bike in suburbia, Wisconsin, I could relate to this third stage where, it becomes work and drudgery, and you become disenchanted toward the bike. And as Lewis puts it, it becomes like, the oar to the galley slave on the boat, and it's drudgery and it's misery. But Lewis says that most of us remain in that third stage, and I would think that actually describes our culture today. And he says that we need to press through, though, to this fourth stage, which is called re-enchantment. And by this, he means, with respect to the bike, that we would learn to view it as gift and then enjoy it in creaturely response. And reading this essay by Lewis kind of unlocked, I think, a lot of what Lewis was doing. But I also think it gives voice to this dominant mode of perceiving in our world, that we no longer see things the way they actually are. But here's the thing. As a result, as Charles Taylor pointed out, unbelief in God becomes possible, and belief in God for those of us who already believe becomes more difficult. And so this is something that affects everything. It affects those in the church. It results in this felt absence of God that is dominant, not only out there in culture, but often in the way that we go to church and experience, the kind of liturgy that we engage in is often very, very shallow. So disenchantment changes everything. And of course, it changes the plausibility of the gospel as well. And so we've got to understand it. And then part of what I'm arguing for in the book, so I kind of have a descriptive part, but then I have this prescriptive, okay, what do we do now that we've arrived at disenchantment? And I'm actually hopeful that if we join with God as Christians and the Holy Spirit, we can work to re-enchant the world. And what I mean by that are 2 things, and then I'll pause. The first thing I mean is that we would begin to see and delight in the world the same way that Jesus does. And then the second thing is, once we've done that, then we would invite others to see and delight in the world the same way Jesus does as well. And in doing so, well, then we can imagine a world, where the gospel actually makes sense, and where Jesus and the whole gospel story is actually viewed as desirable. And and the end goal ultimately is that people will be able to answer this question: what do you make of Jesus, for themselves, and understand it, and it would have meaning, and so on. So yeah, that's the idea.
So what would it look like for Christians to bring re-enchantment? I don't know how you might say to re-enchant others. Yeah. What does that look like practically?
Yeah, I mean, so that's such a great question. A lot of the things I've been reading. So Hans Boersma is a theologian, and he wrote a little book called Reweaving the Sacred Tapestry, where he said the only Christianities that have a future are those that adopt a sacramental view of the world. In other words, that we begin to view the world as created, as sacred, as gift. Jamie K. Smith, a lot of his cultural liturgy series, he says the same thing. He says, the Christianities that have a future are those that re-enchant themselves. And so it begins with us. And in the book, I talk about 3 areas as Christians that we need to, I guess, work on, that are sort of in-house areas, and they would actually correspond to the mind, our conscience, and then our imagination. We need to reject anti-intellectualism. That's the first thing. It's rampant. It's rampant in our culture. It's rampant in our churches. And in being anti-intellectual, though, which is actually, just to call it what it is, it's actually sin. It's actually a scandal when you look at, the call that we are to love God with all of our mind, all of our being. So we've got to reject anti-intellectualism so that we can begin to integrate theology and good philosophy into our view of the world and the story that we inhabit. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is that we need to cease being fragmented people, and we need to catch a vision for becoming whole, where all of our thinkings and willings and emotions are pointed in the right direction and according to the grain of reality. And so we have to catch this vision of being whole, and of course we do that by looking to Christ. And then the third thing I talk about in the book is this idea of rebaptizing the imagination. And it relates to what I said earlier about how we no longer perceive the world in its proper light. And part of that is we don't imagine ourselves as part of a story that's full of transcendence and divinity and where God is fully present. We don't see the world the way that actually Jesus does. And so part of that, I think, is spending time in the Bible and reading the Bible on the Bible's own terms. Part of that is paying attention to the kinds of habits. Sometimes people call them the liturgies that we adopt, whether that's the liturgies we adopt at church, but also the so-called secular liturgies, the things that we do at home, the things that we do daily. You mentioned, we watch a lot of TV and we spend a lot of time in our home. Well, all of that shapes us, and that shapes the way that we imagine our lives and we view our lives. And what's interesting about how we mediate so much of our lives through a screen is that we're actually, as you mentioned earlier, one step removed from reality. And so we're not re-enchanting ourselves, we're actually further removing ourselves. It's actually kind of what I would call a false re-enchantment, because we're looking for something beyond the mundane, but we're finding it through this virtual world, and it's that virtual world is often as fallen and corrupt as the actual world, and so it's not going to re-enchant us and help us see the world the way Jesus does. So yeah, those are a couple thoughts, but I think ultimately it begins with us as believers really recapturing what's historically been called a sacramental view of the world as created by God, a God who lovingly sustains and cares for each one of us and the world he has made.
You brought up virtual reality, and that was my next question, was about the false re-enchantment. You've got at least I counted 3 ways that people do this. So true re-enchantment would be, offering Jesus in its fullest extent to people in
That's right.
everything we do. But other people might want to seek to be re-enchanted in other ways. And so you talk about humanism, augmented or virtual reality, and neo-paganism. Tell us about those false enchantment approaches.
Yeah, so in mapping out this sort of model and let me back up because this will help. What I'm doing in the chapters that you're referring to, I'm mapping out a model to understand culture. And that model is rooted in this ancient idea that reality is a story of wander from God and return to God. And so you see this in Augustine, actually his own individual story, but you see it in the way that he actually believes reality is this ongoing story of wander from God and turning back to God. You see this in Aquinas. You see it in much of the ancient thought, Christian thought about the world. And of course, you see it in Lewis, and you see it in Tolkien and people like that who had eyes to see. And so part of what I'm doing is proposing that we can return to this idea of reenchantment. But in the possibility of returning to a reenchanted view of the world, there's also the possibility of false reenchantments. And so that's what I'm talking about there. And the idea is this, that the intelligentsia tell us that there is no supernatural world, right? Everything's disenchanted, everything's mundane. That's what we've been told by the intelligentsia. But our longings betray us. The shows that we watch, we're fascinated with the occult or zombies or vampires or whatever. These extra mundane things. Actually, superheroes is a great example.
Yep.
The fascination with Marvel and the DC world. These are secondary worlds that are extra mundane. So our longings betray us in some ways, even though the intelligentsia says there is nothing beyond the mundane. And so with that, though, with this post-secular world where religion is, there's renewed interest in religion, the possibility of all these false reenchantments is pretty. There's a strong possibility. And so I talked about a few in the book. So, for example, one of the really interesting things to watch a couple years ago was when Pokemon Go, was it 2016, I think, that summer, where for like 15 minutes, everybody was playing this game, walking around, staring at their phones, and there's little mythical creatures on their phones that somehow augmented onto reality. But that's a kind of false reenchantment if you think about it. We're trying to transcend the mundane by entering into this virtual world and things like that. And of course, those things are fun, but they betray, I think, our longings. Paganism, actually what we might call neo-paganism, and the obsession that we have with the occult, again, is a very dangerous false reenchantment where we long for something more, but we can misdirect it in the wrong place because, on the neo-pagan idea, there's spirits and things like that. There's paranormal activity. But that's not what we're after, right? We want to help people see the world the way that it actually is. And so I actually call this returning to reality, right? The reality is that there is a spiritual world, but it's a world, and there is a sacred order, but it's a world created by the good and loving and perfect God as expressed through Christianity. And so that's the danger. There's this awesome spiritual interest, but we've got to be helping people sort of channel that into the true object of their longing, which is God and Jesus Christ and so on.
So I wanted to follow up here on this concept of the occult, the spiritism. What does that look like practically? That people are interested in horror movies, which portray this stuff. I mean, I know witchcraft, Wiccan, is actually on the rise over in Europe. And I guess here in the United States as well. So do you mean proper, or do you mean like in the entertainment, we're fascinated with vampires and that sort of thing?
I think both, actually. So one of the big ideas, and again, this is a longer story, but one of the products of coming out of the last 300 to 500 years on the other side of the so-called Enlightenment, for those of you who are familiar with a little bit of the history of ideas, one of the big things that has taken place, though, is this idea that there's been this severing between the sacred order and the natural and social order. And so largely today, there's this idea that anything goes, that there's no order to the world, there's no natural order, there's no telos, as we would like to say in philosophy, there's no essences, and there's no way things ought to be. And so we kind of are in the Wild West in terms of our spirituality, right? We're kind of just, a lot of it's, we're drawn to things that are interesting to us or that move us in some way. And so I think our movies, the things that we watch on TV, are actually good insight into the kinds of longings of our heart. Why are we obsessed with the occult or horror or zombies or whatever it is? Well, that betrays that we long for something more than this. And so, yes, we love to watch it, but we love to watch it because in some ways the stories that we watch, the really good ones, they're pointing to some deeper reality or some deeper longing that actually does, I think, connect to life. And so we long for a spiritual world, but again, we can misdirect it. And so I love what C.S. Lewis says. He says that there's this kind of dialectic of desire that's taking place where we seek an object that will satisfy our longing. When we attach to it and it doesn't satisfy, we need to unattach and then continue to seek something else, and we'll reattach, unattach. But he says if we faithfully follow that dialectic, eventually we will find the true object of our longing, which is God. And he says it's a kind of like an experienced ontological argument where if we follow our desires, we'll actually find ultimately the true object of our longing. And so I think it's an opportunity, all this interest in the supranatural. But again, it's something that we've got to be really careful and strategic and continuing to dialogue and ask, is that really the thing that you long for? Let's talk about that and things like that.
Yeah, very nice. Well, Paul, we have to take a short break here. When we come back, though, we're going to explore some further thoughts that you have here on cultural apologetics, which, by the way, if you're just joining us, is the title of Paul's recent book, Cultural Apologetics, Renewing the Christian Voice, Conscience, and Imagination in a Disenchanted World by Zondervan, available now. It just came out last week, right, Paul?
That's right. Yeah, last Tuesday.
Okay, great. So be sure to stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Let's say there's this Christian apologist. You love their message, but have trouble finding their videos, their articles, or social media posts. How do you stay connected to them? We're on it. Defenders Media uses the tools of the digital age to create content for your favorite apologists. We give them more screen time, more digital soapboxes, and more presence to deliver more of the content that you love. That's what we do.
I know that social media is important to those of you who follow my work. Many respond to my videos and posts on Facebook and Twitter, but it becomes impossible after a while to keep up with it all and to continue with research. That's why I'm thrilled that we have found a solution, Defenders Media.
Whether it's a website, whether it's printed material, whether it's a question on graphics, I cannot do what I do and reach my audience without the help of Defenders Media. They have been integral in helping me to reach my audience.
Defenders Media ensures consistent content reaches your hand from today's leading apologists and apologetic ministries, like Mike Licona, Apologetics 315, the Veracity Hill Podcast with Kurt Jarris, and more.
To learn more, text the word Defenders to 555-888, and we'll send you a free PDF of the top 5 ways to share the gospel online. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you'd like to learn how you can become a sponsor or a patron, that's just someone who chips in $5 or $10 a month, go to our website, veracityhill.com, and click on that patron tab. At our website, we've got all of our previous episodes. That's 140 episodes. This is 141. Every Saturday now for, I guess it's 2.5 years. So it's a blessing to be bringing this program to you week after week. We'd love to gain your interest in supporting our program as we continue to go and grow. That's what I've been saying now for a few weeks. Go and grow is what we're doing here at Veracity Hill. So thank you if you'd consider financially supporting us. And if you are one of our supporters, either financially or not, would you please consider giving us a review on iTunes, our Facebook page, or whatever your podcast app is in the Google Play Store. We'd love to get those reviews to help people who maybe are just learning about our program. We've got some folks here chiming in on social media. Apparently, our Spanish outreach is doing well too. We have a couple folks that have said "hola," so great to know that's happening. For those that don't know, we are slowly transcribing, or I should say, translating our transcriptions into Spanish as we reach out to other folks here in the United States and across the globe. And so we've got Corey Miller says, "Rockin' with Paul." Yes, you and Corey go way back, don't you, Paul?
Saw him. I was at Purdue earlier this week speaking, and we hung out. And now he's actually in Texas. So yeah, we cross paths a lot.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we go way back. Yeah.
And tell me about your present work with Ratio Christi.
Yeah, so this past year we've been in a sort of transition. I've been teaching at a seminary for about the last 5 years, and but for the last year, one of the things I've been doing, and it goes back to even earlier how I mentioned this heart for the university, and so Ratio Christi is a national, actually international campus ministry concerned with apologetics, and so one of the hearts that they have is to reach the whole campus, which of course includes professors. And so I've worked with professors for a number of years as a campus minister. And so since I have a kind of transition year, I wanted to help give some lift to that part of their ministry. So Corey and I and some others have been kind of wrestling with how can we help that organization really grow in that area. So yeah, just been doing a few things and enjoying helping them out a lot.
Great,
so.
Great. And also we've got Ike who's tuning in here. He says, "This is great." So I'm glad, Ike, thank you for watching, and I'm glad that our conversation with Paul here is beneficial to you. Now, Paul, I didn't give you the heads up here, but we do a short segment on the show called Rapid Questions.
Awesome.
And so it's just short questions. We get to know a little bit more about you. It's 60 seconds.
Okay.
And
awesome.
so, oh man, he's prepped and ready to go. Look at that.
Let's do it.
All right. First question. What's your clothing store of choice?
JCPenney's.
All right. Taco Bell or KFC?
Neither. Chick-fil-A.
What's your favorite sport?
Soccer. Yeah, soccer, because my kids play it.
What kind of razor do you use?
Gillette.
Do you drink Dr. Pepper?
I do not.
Pick a fictional character you'd like to meet.
Oh my. Oh, that's tough. Oliver Twist.
Okay. Would you ever consider
Odysseus? I'm going to change it. Odysseus.
Odysseus. All right. Would you ever consider living abroad?
Absolutely.
What type of music do you listen to?
Whatever's on my kids' playlist, which seems to be a lot of Christian rap lately, because I run to it and it's okay.
What was the last thing you bought?
Books.
Books.
Always.
Yes. I know that problem.
Right here. Just got it. Woohoo.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. A couple questions. You said you're a fictional character you'd like to meet. Did I hear it correctly? Odysseus?
Odysseus from the Odyssey and the Iliad. Homer.
Yeah. And why would you want to meet him in the fictional
and maybe
world?
He's not a fictional character. I don't know. But
oh, yes. Maybe not.
Yeah, that's true. I said that, and I'm like, wait a minute. Yeah, because I'm fascinated. You read Homer, and again, it's so interesting. The ancient experience of the world is so different from our modern experience of the world. Like, for the ancients, you never knew if you're going to come face to face with a God, and you never knew if divine judgment was, around the corner or things like that. And so Odysseus, especially in the Odyssey, to me, it's such a great story of the Western world, and the things that are great about it, I think, are things that actually point to the gospel story. But why would I like to meet him? Because he's just I don't know. He's a guy that had an adventuresome spirit, and he grew through trial and temptation and folly, which I think is in many ways the human story. I think that story in particular, what we're so drawn to is the idea of life as a quest or a journey, and that we successfully navigate that with others as we grow in virtue and character and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, that just off the top of my head, that's why I'd like to be on that journey with him and grow and, toward the end of coming home.
The story drew you in to the world. And,
that's right.
And so what a great segue here as we continue our discussion on cultural apologetics. So in the first half of the program, we talked about sort of what cultural apologetics is, the problem you see in the world, disenchantment, why people are disenchanted, and what it would mean to re-enchant, and maybe some false, what you call false reenchantments about that, things people pursue, but yet they still, as you said, it's double mundane. There's still no fulfillment and meaning there. And you've talked about a couple times this desire we have, this longing. Lewis talked about the argument from Desire here, that if we desire something beyond ourselves, there's something to that there is something out there for us. And for Lewis, that was the Christian God, that what he ultimately came to believe after his time of atheism in his life. Now, I want to ask you this. So we were talking about the false reenchantments and how it's the role of the Christian to sort of bring people back. For many people, they might come across thinking, well, if I'm going to become a Christian, does that mean I have to give up these TV shows, or I've got to now embrace, DC Talk and Newsboys, if you were me growing up in the 90s, it just seems like Christian culture is so boring. We make cheesy films, Fireproof and those sorts of things. Is that the only way? Is the Christian subculture the only way to re-enchant people?
Yeah, no, I hope not, because oftentimes we don't re-enchant, but it feels sentimental and preachy and crass when we create. Yeah, no, I think the posture that we should have toward culture. So, there's this huge debate among Christians. What is our posture towards culture? Do we condemn it, just carte blanche? Do we consume it carte blanche, or is it somewhere in the middle? Do we copy it and so on? But I think that one of the most helpful books and thinkers that have helped me in this question is actually Andy Crouch, who wrote a book called Culture Making. And in there he says, and I love what he does here, he roots it in Genesis 1 and 2, and the idea that one of the primary things that is revealed about God in the early chapters of Genesis is that he's a creator and cultivator, cultivating God. And so if we want to understand a little bit about what it means to be created in the image of God, well, we too then are called to be creators and cultivators of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so I think our posture towards culture is one of, no, we own it. Like we're the ones that create the best culture because we own goodness, truth, and beauty, right? They come from God. And so, no, you don't have to. I mean, we need to be wise, right? There's some things that Paul says, do not touch or whatever, so you have to have wisdom, but it's not like there's this carte blanche. Everything that's coming from culture is bad. In fact, I think that even Paul in Mars Hill, he's building a bridge from the idols that they worshipped to the gospel, and he's quoting pagan philosophers, Aratus, who was a Stoic philosopher, and then their poets, Epimenides. And he actually says, he quotes Epimenides in Acts 17, verse 28, and he says, for in him we live and move and have our being. Now, that was a quote Epimenides was saying about Zeus. And Paul takes that quote and reinvests it with new meaning, right? And so he sees the good, but then he reinvests it and sort of redirects it. And so, no, I mean, we need to be wise, but no, there's so much good. That's common grace, we might even say sometimes. And one last thing about this, also in Paul, the only two times in Acts when you see him address audiences not like himself, is Acts chapter 15, where he addresses the God-fearing Greeks in Lystra, and then, of course, Acts chapter 17, when he addresses the Greeks and the philosophers. But back to the Acts 15 one, I love what he says there. He says to them, look at all the good things that you have, that God has given you wine and food and seasons for crops and things like that. And so he's saying, look at the good that you have. And then he's just pointing to the giver of those good things. And so I think in terms of our posture as Christians, our posture shouldn't be one of condemning or just carte blanche consuming, but really our posture is one of making culture and then cultivating culture. So taking those that need to be corrected and cultivating them to embody goodness, truth, and beauty, and then of course making good movies and telling good stories and good dance performances and on and on and on. Good landscapes, good omelets, good PowerPoint presentations, whatever it is that we would do it with beauty in mind, because that's what it means to be, as Tolkien would say, sub-creator. So,
the passage in Acts 17 is one of my favorite passages in the whole New Testament. Paul comes to the people there in Athens at the Areopagus, and he basically says, looking around, look at all these gods that you worship. And here you have this altar to an unknown God. let me tell you about this God. And he even says that you people worship the true God, but they just don't know it yet.
Right.
And it's in the way that they've misunderstood. They've suppressed the truth, perhaps. You talk about truth suppression a little bit in the book. So one of the ways that we Christians need to re-enchant is through the use of our imagination, is to recapture people. What does that look like to use our imaginations toward those ends?
Yeah. Okay, good. So, and by the way, the book, actually, the inspiration from the book is Paul's example to us at Mars Hill, and just how brilliantly he identifies a starting place within his Athens. That was, as you just mentioned, the altars to the unknown God. And then he builds a bridge from that starting place using reason, appealing to their conscience and their imagination. He builds a bridge to Jesus, and as you get to the end of the passage, he basically introduces them to the one who stands, at the heart of Christianity, and forces this question, what do you make of Jesus Christ? And so I took that model really from Paul, this Paul-inspired model, and applied it to our Athens. So what are the starting places? And the three that I'm working with are these three universal longings for goodness, truth, and beauty. And then we use the planks of reason on a quest to truth, the plank of our conscience on a quest for goodness, and then the plank of our imagination on a quest for beauty. And that third plank, in many ways, it's kind of interesting. I think that the church is waking up to the importance of beauty and the imagination, and apologetics folks are as well. We now read of things like imaginative apologetics, or there's a book that came out a few years ago called Aesthetic Apologetics, beauty. But the idea here is that we are imaginative animals, right? And that we imagine ourselves as part of a story. And so that's part of it. And that the imagination longs for beauty. And I always go back to this line in Augustine. So St. Augustine lived 1,500 years ago. He wrote the very first, I know you know this, Kurt, but he wrote the very first spiritual autobiography in the Western world. And in book 3, he says of God, he says, "You are the beauty of all beautiful things." And that's what we're doing when we engage the imagination. We're setting them on a journey through this universal longing for beauty to the source of beauty, which is Jesus Christ. And I love how Plato, and actually, it's a Platonic thought that beauty evokes desire. And so when we have these experiences of beauty, they awaken us. And so in a culture that's largely driven by image, which is the culture we find ourselves in, one of the most important planks that we need to be accessing, I think, as apologists or cultural apologists, is that plank of beauty. Set them on that journey. So for my wife, I think we'd be British. Asked about going to another world. I think in another life we'd be British because we love, like Poldark, if you know the show, and the guy galloping on the fields, the cliffs in Cornwall there, that awakens. There's longing there. That sets us, as Lewis would say, we don't long for the in the thing, we long for the beauty through the thing. And that's how we can, I think, use the aesthetic currency of our age to actually point people on a journey that ends in faith.
You talked about Lewis there and pointing and looking along. That reminds me, you talk about this in his book. He's got an essay in his book, God in the Dock. Or rather, it's a collection of his essays in that book. And he talks about the sunbeam here, how he was in a tool shed, and he could see rays of light coming through, and he could see the sunbeam. And so it's one thing to look at the sunbeam, see the particles of dust coming through, but it's another thing to look along the sunbeam and to see its source.
That's right.
And so for us, we can look at the sunbeam, and it's good. We need to help people see the sunbeams, and then encourage them to look along the sunbeam. What is the source here? What is the source for goodness, truth, and beauty? And so that's cultural apologetics is about the winsome persuasion. It's not just about the arguments. It's informed by the arguments, but it's really about the winsome persuasion of leading people to Christ. So in that sense, it's one of the strongest evangelistic tools to lead people to the kingdom. We were talking about culture, and and how I grew up listening to DC Talk and Newsboys. U2, the band, has done more work for Christ's kingdom than DC Talk and Newsboys combined. U2 has written lyrics to non-Christian audiences for decades now, communicating these truths. And some of them are explicit, where the streets have no name. U2 even has a song called Yahweh, of all songs. I mean, just their reach is so wide. I mean, millions and millions, maybe even a billion or more people on planet Earth know about U2. And so it's an amazing testament to their work as cultural apologists.
That's right. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, and it's interesting in the book, I actually, for each of those, reason, conscience, and imagination, I look at them using that analogy from Lewis. What is reason? And let's understand it. What is the conscience? What is the imagination? But then we look along them, and I try to help the reader, help people go on that journey. Both, there's actually an argument, from reason to God, and from morality to God, and from the imagination to God. And that's important. We want to give those arguments. But then we want to help them walk along that plank or that beam, and experience beauty and be led to the source, just like you say. So I think it's just that essay by Lewis, I think, is really helpful for understanding our task as evangelists and apologists, and just, men and women ourselves, who are wired in these ways. And we want to connect all of who we are to all of what God has. So.
Yeah. And you're certainly, especially you as a philosopher and someone who's done philosophy of religion, you're definitely not opposed to reason here. It has its place. Yeah, you're very supportive. I mean, you're in your lifestyle and in your work, you're very supportive of the role reason plays. But you recognize that it's not the end-all, be-all in evangelism, in apologetics. So tell me, what does that mean to be looking along reason?
Yeah, so looking along reason would be that would be what most of us think about, I think, when we think about apologetics, is giving arguments for, from science, from history, from philosophy. So actually in the chapter on reason and truth, the longing for truth, I actually gave an argument from reason to God. So that's looking at reason. And then I actually just gave some examples of how, what's a good argument? And like you said, how do we win some persuasion and things like that? And just some basic, how do we identify starting points and our starting posture and things like that? But yeah, so that plank has been well walked, and rightly so, right? Like Christianity, at least since the Enlightenment, but even before that, has been under attack as irrational. And so we've got to, and of course a cultural apologetic has to engage the mind, because we're rational animals and we want our lives to hook up to truth. But yeah, my point is it's not an either or, it's a both and. We've got to address all the aspects. But yeah, that would look most like what we're familiar with, just giving arguments, right, and so on.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, and so finally you talk about the conscience. What role does that play, and how does one look along the conscience to God?
Yeah, so this one's difficult because we're so confused in our culture, and there's an in-house debate about social justice. There's a culture-wide debate about it. So here's what I think. So I said earlier that we have this universal longing for goodness, and I parsed that out into 3 sub-longings, and maybe this will help us a little bit. I think that longing for goodness is composed of a longing for justice, right? So we want the world, we do want the world to be made right. That's just a deep-seated longing. It's part of this longing for goodness. Secondly, though, there's a longing for wholeness. Like that we want, as I said earlier, we don't want to be fragmented people. We don't want to be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And then the third thing is this longing for significance, that we want our lives to matter. I actually think all those 3, they correspond really nicely to the 3 parts of morality that C.S. Lewis talked about. Again, you can see the influence of Lewis here, but in his chapter, The Cardinal Virtues in Mere Christianity, he talks about he talks about the moral life, and he uses an analogy of a fleet of ships. And he says, for every fleet of ships to be successful, it takes 3 components. Individually, each ship needs to be seaworthy. Socially, each ship needs to be rightly related with respect to each other. And then they all need to be rightly related with respect to their end. And he uses that analogy to talk about the 3 parts to morality. Individually, we need to be rightly related. That's our character. That's our longing for wholeness. And so as we live whole lives, that awakens in others, a longing to live whole lives. And of course, we only find that in Christ, and there's our opportunity. Socially, we long for right relationships with each other. So there is this opportunity to be agents of shalom, as we would put it more biblically, to seek justice in this world. And so we can use that as part of and we can partner with people on that in appropriate ways to help people along with that journey. And that's the social component. And then the third component, this longing to live a life that matters toward a chief end. That one I think is really interesting. In the book, I talked about this giving pledge. I don't know if you've heard of this. All the really rich people like Warren Buffett and Facebook founder and others, they've basically pledged to give, $1 billion or half their wealth away over their life. But if you go online and look at their actual pledges when they make that, almost every one of them says something like this. They have some obligation to pass on their wealth. They feel the sense of responsibility that their life would actually matter. And that's really telling to me, I think. And so that raises a whole host of questions. And so last thing, all of this, though, I think is so interesting in light of what Blaise Pascal, who was an Enlightenment thinker, mathematician, he said that this longing for goodness in our world, we long for it because we have a memory of a time when man was truly happy. And I think that's what we're doing when we awaken this longing by living a good life and probing this with others. We remind them of a time when things were actually as they should be, and we set them on a journey really to find their way back home again. So,
yeah, Pascal is one of those, I think, underrated guys. Even in apologetics, I think his wager is underrated.
Yeah,
And
he's got a lot to say. Yeah,
people just don't realize what a thought-provoking writer and thinker he was. Lots of good stuff there. All right, final question here. You talked about directing people back home. That's what apologetics is all about, isn't it? It's leading people back home to who God created them to be, and that fulfillment is finally, ultimately found in the Christian faith, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the the things that I've become convinced about is if you think about our lives, we enter into an ongoing story the moment that we're born, right? There's a story, and it's as theologians like Kevin Van Hooser and others have done so well to show us that there's this divine drama. I love how Calvin actually puts it. He talks about the universe as the theater of God's glory. The heavens and the earth are the theater of God's glory. And so we enter into this ongoing story. And so I think if we understand our life as a quest or a journey, well, we're headed somewhere. Well, where are we headed? A successful journey, man's highest good is union with God and everything that's wrapped up with that. Home, and I think home is a great metaphor for that. And so this actually comes back, the last chapter in the book is about home and how to help people find their way there. But this actually comes back to the very beginning of the book where we talk about how all the from God and then return. We're kind of at the bottom, the wandering part, and our job as apologists and cultural apologists is just to help them really come back to that place that is, this memory of a time when things were as they should be. And I think home is a great metaphor for that, because really we live our lives in a home. It's not always ideal, but we have in our hearts this picture of a place where we belong and a place where we're known and loved. And that metaphor, I don't think that metaphor is by accident, right? That the rhythm of our life is one of home and then away, and then home again every day. That's the rhythm of our day. But that's actually the story of the world. And I would submit to you it's the story of the Bible as well. And so what we're trying to help them do is just locate their lives in this great story of God. And in doing that, they actually find a story that understands them, that is not only true, which is of course important, but it satisfies all the longings. It's true to the way the world ought to be as well. So that's what we're doing as a cultural apologist.
That's great. And I want to encourage folks again to check it out. Cultural Apologetics, Renewing the Christian Voice, Conscience, and Imagination in a Disenchanted World. Out now, published by Zondervan. And if you get the chance, check out the video lectures as well. A great 2-disc set here of 15 lessons. You can see here the nice, fine cinematography, at Defenders Media. We appreciate good work. Of course, Zondervan's got a great team there to do that. So glad you had the chance to record those as well, Paul. Thank you so much for coming on our program today, and we look forward to touching base in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Kurt. It's been great to chat with you today.
Yes, God bless you.
Thank you. You too.
I will say this for the book. We'll be sure to put a link at our website, and so when we publish the video here of today's program, if you want just a quick link, go to our website, veracityhill.com, check out that post, and you see his book as well. Otherwise, you can search Google or Amazon for Cultural Apologetics. And so what a wonderful chance it is for us to explore these notions of engagement, a way in which we can just go and live out. For many folks interested in apologetics, it's just about the arguments and debating and butting heads. But that's not just what apologetics is. That's not the reason side of it. Apologetics is winsome persuasion, leading people to Christ, into his kingdom, and into the fullness of life that they can find there. And so we need to be an all-encompassing member of society, being the best shoemaker, being the best garbage man, taking pride, a healthy, righteous pride in our work and in the way we present and create art. I personally have struggled to go to these so-called Christian films. To me, I don't have that subcategory. It is a film, and whether it's good or bad, it's on an objective standard. And so Christians need to be good at making art. We shouldn't be making Christian art. Let's just make art and reach people. And Paul's book here is a great opportunity for us to learn and think more about what that means for us as Christians, and how we can use that to reach people for God's glory. All right, well, that does it for the show today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons and the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, and Fox Restoration. I want to thank our technical producer, Chris, for all of the fine work that he has done today and week in and week out. And to our guest, Paul Gould, for his time on this Saturday afternoon talking to us about cultural apologetics and why every Christian should go buy his book and read it and check it out. It's a great book. I see here Arthur on Facebook is encouraging everyone to check it out as well. So please do so. Last but not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.